Carl Jung didn't just study the mind. He went into the darkness of his own and came back with a vision that changed psychology forever. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in the small Swiss village of Keswil on the edge of Lake Constance. To most, it was a quiet childhood in the countryside. But for Jung, even the earliest years were saturated with mystery, fear, and visions that seemed to bleed in from another world. His memories would later read less like the account of a boy and more like the opening chapters of a myth. His father, Paul Jung, was a Protestant pastor. His mother, Emily, came from a family steeped in strange phenomena, seances, apparitions, things that went bump in the night. Their house was filled with religion, but also with a heavy silence, punctuated by moments of the inexplicable. Even as a boy, Jung sensed he lived on the border of two worlds: the rational, structured realm of his father's sermons, and the shadowy, unpredictable depths his mother seemed to know too well. One of his earliest memories was of sitting in the parsonage, staring at a figure that seemed both real and unreal. He would later write of two personalities within him. Personality number one, the outward boy who went to school, obeyed rules, and lived in the daylight. And personality number two, the ancient one, the dreamer who belonged to centuries past, who carried wisdom and terror that had no place in a child's frame. This split would haunt him all his life, and it would also become the seed of his psychology. The human being is never one, but many. In Jung's family, the veil between the visible and invisible was thin. His mother was known to fall into strange trances. Objects cracked and shattered without explanation. Stories whispered of ancestors who heard voices, who saw spirits. And then there was his cousin, Helene Preiswerk, a girl who became the family's medium. Helene was young, imaginative, but when the lights dimmed and the seances began, she transformed. Her voice would change, her body stiffen, and messages would pour through her that seemed to come from somewhere else. At the family table, she was a playful girl. In the seance circle, she was an oracle. For Jung, watching her was both thrilling and terrifying. It showed him that the unconscious could speak with a voice of its own, that it could seize a person and speak truths that no one expected. As Jung grew older, he began to experiment himself. In his teenage years, he attended seances with Helene, recording the strange communications, the movements of tables, the rapping sounds that punctuated the silence. What others dismissed as fraud or hysteria, Jung observed with the intensity of a scientist and the awe of a mystic. He was not content to explain it away, nor to blindly believe. He wanted to understand, what is happening here? From where do these voices come? These early experiments would later become the foundation of his doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena. While most of his peers in medicine dismissed such things as superstition, Jung dared to analyze them as genuine psychological events. The unconscious, he argued, was not just a private storehouse of forgotten memories. It was an active force, capable of producing visions, voices, even physical effects. The seance was not proof of ghosts, perhaps, but it was proof that the human soul contained depths that science had barely begun to chart. But Jung's curiosity was not only professional, it was personal. He himself experienced uncanny events that shook his confidence in the ordinary. He wrote of hearing a loud crack in the dining room, only to find the wooden table split down the middle without cause. On another night, a heavy cabinet shattered its glass doors with no one near. For the young Jung, these were not tricks. They were eruptions of the unconscious into the physical world. He began to suspect that psyche and matter were not entirely separate, but bound by hidden threads. This suspicion would one day grow into his famous concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the psyche's hidden order. But in his youth, it was raw, frightening, and mysterious. He lived in a haunted world, one that seemed to respond to inner states with outer signs. Yet for all the strangeness, Jung was never swallowed by superstition. He balanced the uncanny with discipline. He excelled at school, read voraciously, and immersed himself in science and philosophy. By the time he entered medical studies at the University of Basel, he carried both worlds within him. the rational discipline of science, and the trembling awe of the paranormal. When his professors mocked spiritualism, Jung said little, but inside, he knew better. He had seen too much. He had lived too close to the edge, where psyche and spirit collided. To deny it would be to betray his own experience. Looking back, Jung would later confess that without those early years, without Helene's trances, without the cracking tables, without his mother's strange moods, he would never have discovered the unconscious as he did. They were not accidents of childhood. They were initiations. They forced him to acknowledge that reality was larger, stranger, and more alive than the materialists of his age could accept. And so the boy from Keswill grew into a man who could no longer settle for half-truths. He would not be content to choose between science and spirit. He would chart a course that dared to hold both. His psychology was born not only in the clinic, but in the seance circle, in the silence of haunted rooms, in the dreams of a boy who knew that the soul had many voices. This was the beginning. The stage was set. The world of Freud and the world of Jung would soon collide. But before that great rupture, Jung was still the boy who had glimpsed another world, and could never unsee it. When Jung entered the University of Basel in the 1890s, he was already a young man torn between two destinies. One path led into the solid ground of medicine, with its microscopes, lectures, and textbooks. The other pulled him toward the invisible, the mysterious undercurrents he had felt since childhood. For most, these paths could not be reconciled. For Jung, they would have to be. At Basel, Jung devoured philosophy as eagerly as anatomy. He read Kant and Schopenhauer alongside Gray's Anatomy. He carried Goethe in one pocket and medical notes in the other. His classmates saw him as quiet, even eccentric, but beneath the stillness burned a relentless curiosity. What is the true nature of the human being? Are we only flesh and neurons, or something infinitely deeper? During these years, Jung began writing his dissertation. It would not be about bones, blood, or organs. It would be about the world most scientists ignored, the occult, titled On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. It centered on the trances and visions of his cousin Helene Preiswerk, the very medium who had fascinated him in boyhood. For Jung, Helene's case was not entertainment. It was a window into the unconscious. He described her shifting personalities, her prophetic statements, her moments of brilliance, and her long descents into exhaustion. Where others saw trickery or hysteria, Jung saw the psyche splitting and recombining, speaking in voices hidden from ordinary awareness. When he defended the dissertation in 1902, it was controversial, even scandalous. His professors shifted uneasily. Some called it pseudoscience. Others dismissed it as youthful folly. But Jung stood his ground. He argued that to dismiss such phenomena outright was to blind psychology to its richest sources. The human mind, he insisted, must be studied not only in health and illness, but also in its extremes, in its uncanny eruptions. After Basel, Jung's journey carried him to Zurich, to the famous Bergholzli Asylum under Eugen Bleuler, one of the leading psychiatrists of the age. Bergholzli was no ordinary hospital. It was a crucible of modern psychiatry, a place where the most tormented souls of Switzerland lived behind barred windows. Here, Jung confronted psychosis directly. Patients spoke in broken languages, acted out rituals, fell into catatonic silence, or burst into wild visions. To many doctors, these were meaningless symptoms to be controlled with restraint. But Jung listened. He sat with patients others avoided. He drew their fantasies, wrote down their ravings, and slowly, he began to see a pattern. One young woman believed she was being poisoned by her relatives. Another man claimed voices from the dead gave him instructions. To the staff, these were simply delusions. To Jung, they were myths in raw form, archetypes bursting through the fragile walls of the ego. Madness, he thought, was not only chaos, it was the unconscious demanding to be heard. This perspective marked Jung as different. His superiors noticed his unusual sensitivity, his refusal to reduce patients to case files. He coined the phrase complex, to describe clusters of feelings and ideas that could dominate the psyche, often outside of awareness. These complexes, he argued, were the hidden puppeteers behind neuroses and psychoses alike. His work at Berg-Holtzli brought him recognition. In 1905, he was appointed senior physician. His papers on word association experiments, where patients responded to trigger words and revealed unconscious conflicts, gained international attention. Beneath the laboratory precision of the method, Jung was still chasing the same mystery, the unseen forces that guide human life. Yet even as his career advanced, Jung could not ignore the uncanny. Strange events followed him still. Dreams shook him awake. Symbols haunted his imagination. The split he had felt as a boy, between the rational and the mystical, had not dissolved. It had only grown more urgent. It was during this time that Jung first encountered the writings of Sigmund Freud. Freud's work on hysteria and dreams seemed to offer a framework, a language that could connect the hidden worlds Jung had witnessed with the science he practiced. When the two finally met, it felt like destiny. But destiny, as Jung would learn, always carries the seeds of rupture. For now, however, Jung was still the ambitious young doctor at Berg-Holtzli, walking the echoing corridors, sitting across from the broken, and daring to believe that their madness was not nonsense, but revelation. The boy who once watched tables crack and mediums speak had become the man who listened to the voices of the insane and refused to turn away. By the time Jung's work at Berg-Holtzli began to make waves, a name was already echoing across Europe: Sigmund Freud. To many, Freud was the pioneer who dared to peer into forbidden territory, unmasking sexuality and repression as the engines of the psyche. For Jung, reading Freud's interpretation of dreams was like hearing a language he had always known but never spoken aloud. Here was someone who, like him, believed the unconscious was real, dynamic, and powerful. When Jung and Freud finally met in 1907, it was electric. They spoke for 13 hours straight, without pause, as if two halves of the same mind had reunited. Freud, nearly 20 years older, saw in Jung not just a colleague, but a successor. Jung was brilliant, disciplined, and not tainted by the anti-Semitism Freud battled daily in Vienna. To many, Jung looked like the perfect heir to psychoanalysis. For several years, their alliance was fierce. Jung became the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association. He defended Freud publicly, wrote essays expanding on Freud's theories, and carried the torch of psychoanalysis into new circles. To outsiders, the two were inseparable, master and disciple, father and son. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Freud's focus was unwavering: sexuality as the root of neurosis, repression as the central conflict. For Jung, this was too narrow. He respected Freud's brilliance, but he could not accept reducing the vast landscapes of the psyche to a single drive. For Jung, the unconscious was not just a cellar of forbidden desires. It was a cathedral filled with myth, symbol, archetype, a whole cosmos waiting to be explored. The tension grew with every conversation. Freud pressed Jung to accept libido as the foundation. Jung pushed back, insisting on spiritual and symbolic dimensions. The private letters between them reveal the struggle. Freud urging loyalty, Jung pleading for freedom of thought. The breaking point came in 1912, with Jung's publication of Psychology of the Unconscious. In it, he openly challenged Freud's dogma, arguing that libido was not merely sexual energy, but a general life force capable of expressing itself in myth, art, religion, and creativity. To Freud, this was betrayal. To Jung, it was liberation. Their correspondence turned cold. Their meetings became battles. At one point, Jung claimed Freud collapsed after an argument, fainting as if struck by the weight of dissent. The symbolic father-son bond had reached its tragic climax, the son refusing to live under the father's shadow. In 1913, the break was complete. Jung resigned from the Psychoanalytic Association. He was branded a heretic, accused of abandoning science for mysticism. The rift sent shockwaves through the intellectual world. Students were forced to choose sides. Freud's Vienna or Jung's Zurich. For Jung, the cost was devastating. He lost friends, colleagues, and the protection of Freud's towering influence. Worse, he was plunged into his own personal crisis. Visions, dreams, and fantasies that overwhelmed him, leaving him unsure whether he was descending into madness. Yet out of this rupture came rebirth. Freed from Freud's authority, Jung began to carve his own path. Where Freud saw repression, Jung saw myth. Where Freud saw illness, Jung saw initiation. Where Freud limited the unconscious to sexuality, Jung opened it to the entire human story. Their split was not just professional, it was archetypal. Freud had been the stern father, demanding loyalty. Jung had been the son, compelled to rebel. In their drama, one could see the very forces they studied: projection, shadow, archetype, destiny. Looking back, Jung admitted he owed Freud a great debt. Without him, he might never have dared to plunge so deeply into the unconscious. But he also knew he could not remain in Freud's orbit. His destiny was to go further, to risk more, to map the soul in ways Freud never imagined. The break with Freud marked the end of one chapter and the terrifying beginning of another. Alone, Jung now faced his own unconscious directly, with no master to guide him. What followed would become the most dangerous and creative period of his life, the years of visions that would give birth to the Red Book and to the unique psychology that bears his name. The year was 1913. Jung was 40 years old, successful, respected, and now utterly alone. His break with Freud had cost him his professional circle, his friendships, and his sense of certainty. Worse still, Europe itself was sliding toward catastrophe. The Great War loomed like a storm on the horizon, and then the visions began. It started with dreams. Jung saw rivers of blood flooding across Europe, corpses piled high, cities burning. He felt the terror of war before the world did, as if his psyche were tuned to the collective unconscious of the continent. Soon, the visions invaded his waking life. He saw gods rising from the sea, serpents coiling through the skies, voices speaking from shadows. For many, these would be signs of madness. For Jung, they were a summons. He realized he had to face the unconscious directly, not as a scientist observing from a distance, but as a man descending into its depths. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. Each evening, he withdrew into solitude. With pen and paper, he practiced what he later named active imagination, allowing images to rise unfiltered, dialoguing with figures that appeared, sketching the mandalas and scenes that unfolded in his inner theater. He did not control the visions, he participated in them. What he encountered was staggering. A wise old man with kingfisher wings, whom Jung later named Philemon, appeared as his inner guide. Dark, terrifying figures stalked him, demanding he listen to truths he did not want to hear. He spoke with gods and demons, wandered deserts and cathedrals, drank from the blood of myth itself. For years, he filled notebooks with these dialogues and paintings. Later bound into a massive red leather volume, it became known as the Red Book. To outsiders, it looked like the work of a madman. Vivid drawings of serpents, cosmic eggs, gods, and flames. But for Jung, it was the record of his descent and his transformation. In these pages, Jung discovered that the unconscious was not merely personal, but collective. The figures he met were not just fragments of his psyche, they were archetypes, timeless presences that spoke with the voice of humanity itself. By listening, he believed, he was participating in a drama larger than himself. A drama as old as myth. The experience nearly broke him. He feared for his sanity, avoided friends, and sometimes wondered if he would survive. But out of the darkness, meaning crystallized. He began to see that the unconscious was not only chaos, it was also wisdom, a reservoir of images that, if integrated, could lead to healing and wholeness. This was the birth of his most daring ideas: the collective unconscious, archetypes, individuation, synchronicity. Each concept was seeded in the soil of his visions, watered by the storms of his own despair. Jung's psychology was not invented in a library. It was lived, suffered, wrestled from the depths of his soul. During these years, Europe erupted in World War I, as if confirming his visions of blood and fire. Jung's personal apocalypse mirrored the collective one. But while nations tore themselves apart, Jung was quietly writing a map for the soul's survival. By the late 1910s, the intensity of the visions eased. Jung returned to teaching, writing, and treating patients, but he never abandoned what he had learned. Philemon remained a presence, reminding him that reason alone could not navigate the psyche's depths. The unconscious was not to be conquered, but engaged. When the Red Book was finally published, decades after his death, the world was stunned. Scholars and readers saw the raw, unfiltered imagination of a man who had dared to dialogue with his inner world. What once seemed madness now appeared as the hidden wellspring of his genius. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious was both ordeal and initiation. It taught him that every human carries within a private myth, a sacred drama unfolding beneath the surface of daily life. To ignore it is to risk being consumed by it. To engage it is to begin the journey of individuation, the path toward becoming whole. This chapter of Jung's life revealed his essence. Not a professor in an ivory tower, but a man willing to step into the abyss of his own mind and return with treasures for the rest of us. By the 1920s, Carl Jung had emerged from his dark night of the soul transformed. The Red Book years had nearly consumed him, but they also gave birth to a psychology unlike any other, one rooted in science, myth, art, and lived experience. Now he returned to the world, carrying insights that would shape the rest of his life. One of his most radical ideas was synchronicity. For centuries, people had spoken of fate, omens, and meaningful coincidences. Science dismissed them as chance. But Jung believed otherwise. He saw that inner states and outer events could align in ways too precise to ignore. He told the story of a patient who spoke of a dream featuring a golden scarab beetle. At that very moment, a beetle tapped against his office window. Jung opened it and handed the insect to her. The shock dissolved her resistance to therapy. For Jung, this was not trickery. It was synchronicity, an acausal connection, a glimpse into the deeper order binding psyche and matter. Such stories multiplied. Dreams foreshadowed events. Symbols appeared in both visions and daily life. Jung concluded that the psyche and the physical world were not separate realms, but reflections of one underlying reality. He called it the unus mundus, the one world, where spirit and matter intertwine. This idea resonated with mystics and scientists alike. Physicist Wolfgang Pauli, a Nobel Prize winner, became Jung's close collaborator, exploring the parallels between quantum physics and synchronicity. For Jung, science and spirituality were not enemies but partners, each illuminating the other. As his fame spread, Jung traveled widely. He lectured in America, England, and India. He studied alchemy, astrology, and comparative religion, finding in each echoes of the archetypes he had mapped. He saw symbols of transformation in medieval alchemical texts, in the mandalas of Tibet, in the myths of Africa. Everywhere, the human soul spoke the same language of images. But Jung was no guru. He did not want disciples. He urged people to experience these truths for themselves, through dreams, through reflection, through the courage to face their own shadows. "I am not a prophet," he often insisted. "I am an empiricist." His empiricism, however, was of a wider kind, one that included the inner world as real as the outer. In his later years, Jung became a cultural sage. Writers, artists, and seekers came to his home in Küsnacht to sit with him by the lakeside, to hear his thoughts on soul, myth, and the fate of humanity. He spoke slowly, with gravitas, as if each word carried centuries. He warned that modern man, obsessed with technology and progress, was in danger of losing his soul. Without myth, without connection to the unconscious, society risked being devoured by its own shadow. Even in old age, Jung continued to dream. He recorded visions of towers, of mandalas, of luminous figures guiding him toward death. In one striking dream, he saw himself high above the earth, gazing down upon continents, aware that his life was but one small thread in the vast tapestry of existence. In 1944, he suffered a heart attack and had near-death experiences. He wrote of floating above the earth, seeing its curvature, feeling the vast silence of the cosmos. He described entering a great temple, radiant with light, where he sensed the presence of eternity itself. But he was called back, returned to his body, to live a few more decades. The visions left him with serenity, a certainty that death was not an end, but a passage. By the 1950s, his influence was immense. His books, Psychological Types, Symbols of Transformation, Answer to Job, stirred both admiration and controversy. He dared to wrestle with theology, to question the nature of God, to explore evil not as abstract doctrine, but as psychological reality. He insisted that divinity itself must be seen in light of the human psyche, and that humanity's image of God evolves as the unconscious unfolds. In 1957, he began dictating his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It was not a typical autobiography. It was a confession of visions, symbols, and encounters with the depths. He spoke candidly of his seances, his dreams, his dialogues with Philemon, his belief in spirits, and his conviction that the unconscious connects us to something eternal. Carl Jung died in 1961, at the age of 85, in his beloved home by Lake Zurich. The world mourned not just a psychologist, but a visionary who had dared to unite science and spirit. His funeral was simple, yet those who attended felt the weight of a man who had lived close to the mysteries. Today, Jung's legacy endures not only in psychology, but in culture itself. His ideas of archetypes, shadow work, individuation, and synchronicity permeate literature, film, art, and spirituality. He gave modern humanity a language for the soul, a way to speak of dreams, myths, and coincidences without abandoning reason. He once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That was his message, distilled from decades of visions, research, and struggle. To look within, to face the shadow, to embrace the archetypes, to walk the road of individuation. This was the path to wholeness. And so, Jung's life closes like the myth he himself embodied. The boy who saw spirits in his childhood home became the man who charted the unconscious. The doctor who broke with Freud became the visionary who gave us a map of the soul. The elder who dreamed of eternity left us with the courage to face our own depths, not as disciples, not as imitators, but as travelers on the same eternal journey. To awaken, to become whole, to find meaning in the dance between light and shadow.